There are many reasons to love the Zelda franchise, from its breathtaking atmosphere and sense of adventure, to the unique and elaborate dungeons, but something that I've always enjoyed are without a doubt the boss fights. Now, after getting my ass handed to me by Queen Gibdo in Tears of the Kingdom, I guess I was bound to die eventually. Yeah, pretty big skill issue, I know. But it got me thinking, if I were to take a look back on the franchise as a whole, what exactly would I consider the hardest boss from each game? And well, that's exactly what we're going to be discussing in this video. Now, obviously these choices are just my opinion. What destroyed me isn't necessarily going to turn around and destroy you as well, which doesn't really make sense, but you get my point. Also, spoiler warnings for anyone who hasn't played through each of these games. Now, starting us off is the original Zelda, released all the way back in 1986 for the NES. Seeing as this was the very first time players ever got to take control of the hero of Hyrule, Link, the gameplay and as a result the bosses were never going to be that complex. I mean, it's quite cool actually to compare where we started. I have no idea what I'm doing, honestly. To where we are today. No, stay the fuck away. No, man, what am I doing? Out of the 7 bosses faced in the original Zelda, there are really only 2 that could be considered somewhat difficult, at least in my opinion. The majority of these bosses had very simple movement patterns, and their attacks were very basic. That is until you come across Gleeok, the multi-headed dragon that has now become a reoccurring boss in the series. I have a sneaking suspicion that Nintendo knew that this guy was the toughest fight, as he appeared not once, not twice, but 3 times, each with a new growth spurt in the form of a new head. By the time you reach the 8th dungeon, the Lion, Gleeok has now grown 4 heads, which you must destroy while avoiding the copious amounts of fireballs he spits out. Even when you destroy one of his heads, he starts cheating and his head still continued to fly around shooting fireballs. Ganon was my other consideration, but seeing as he only takes 3 hits and then can be finished off with a single silver arrow, places him behind Gleeok in this case. Now on to what many consider the worst Zelda game, well at least those who haven't had the pleasure of experiencing the CDI games.
You've killed me!
Good.
But regardless of your thoughts on Zelda 2 Adventure of Link, what is universally accepted is that this game is hard. I never played this game growing up and only recently went back to play it, and well, I still got bodied. The question is though, out of the many challenging bosses, which proved to be the most difficult? Link's Shadow or Dark Link is always in contention and is notorious for his difficulty. Well, unless you did what pretty much everyone did after getting slapped around by him multiple times. But even Dark Link pales in comparison to Thunderbird, the penultimate boss found in the Great Castle. Before you can even damage this thing, you have to obtain and use the Thunder Spell to expose its face. Once exposed, you have to time jump attacks to hit the only vulnerable area on his body. At the same time, Thunderbird rains down endless amounts of fireballs, which speed up the more damage he takes. This boss took me so many attempts to finally beat, and I remember just trying to spam him down, which, well, if anyone's played it, you know that never works out. The consistent damage you take while trying to squeeze in attacks makes this the most challenging boss in one of the most challenging games. I think this is where I might start losing some people. No, I don't believe that dumbass bug Moldorm is the hardest boss in A Link to the Past. Sure, he's annoying, and I hate that he heals to full every time you get knocked down, but he can't actually kill you. Blind was one of the first bosses I considered, as the arena in which you fight him can get quite hectic throughout the fight. But if we're talking about the most hectic, then look no further than Mothula, whom I consider the toughest fight in A Link to the Past. Not only is the room padded with blade traps that continuously move from side to side, but Mothula casually flies around the room shooting lasers at Link. The most effective method in dealing with Mothula was always to use the Fire Rod, but I distinctly remember never having enough magic power left, and trying to deal with him with a sword was its own nightmare. Link's Awakening took it to the next level, pretty much doubling the number of bosses players had to defeat. And while that may sound like a good thing, it certainly didn't make for tougher bosses. But out of the 15 bosses found in this game, the hardest was the Slime Eel, who appeared in the Catfish's Maw. The fight begins with the eel's tail breaking out of the center before his smug face goes around the room making 4 holes for him to slime out of. In order to defeat this guy, you had to use the hook shot to pull him out of the walls, which exposed his heart. Hitting his heart enough times would finish him off. The only problem was that his tail spun around the room the whole time, meaning you had to look out for it and avoid it, while also trying to get into a position to hookshot him. You could use the rock feather to jump over his tail, but that would mean you had to either switch back to your sword or hookshot when it was time to finish him off. Overall, I consider him to be the hardest, and before anyone questions why Death Eye isn't at the top, you have to realise that I'm Australian, and as a part of our schooling, we learn how to decapitate with boomerangs. Ocarina of Time is one of, if not the most critically acclaimed game of all time, and its boss fights certainly don't fall short of that, with it featuring some of the most iconic boss fights in the franchise. Out of the 9 bosses, 10 if you count Ganon's form separately, there are pretty much no outright bad bosses. As for the most difficult, however, this was a toss-up between a few. Morpher was tricky to handle due to the reliance on the hookshot, and Bongo Bongo gave me a lot of trouble when I was younger, as I was never really that great at Z targeting, and his swooping and slamming attacks threw me off a ton. The Ganon fights were interesting, but let's be real, he ain't winning any Wimbledon titles with that form. And that leaves us with what I always thought to be the most difficult fight, Twin Rover. This fight in particular has 2 phases, but the first one was definitely the tougher of the 2. You had to use the mirror shield to absorb the fire or ice element shot at you and then direct it with the mirror shield back at the other sister. Sounds simple enough, right? Well, these 2 annoyingly flew around the room, making it that much harder to angle it just right to get that hidden. Upon entering the second phase, the sisters merge and become Twin Rover. Here the fight becomes much simpler. You just absorb the same element 3 times and fire it back at her, allowing you to finish her off with the Master Sword. Georg. Now with a name like that, you know you're in for something special. And by something special, I mean some of the most frustrating gameplay ever. This fight in particular, kind of like the anglerfish from Link's Awakening, actually had a few changes implemented when it was remastered for the 3DS. In the original game though, Georg acted like a fish. He just swam around in the water while occasionally jumping over the platform in an attempt to knock Link into the water. While in the water, Link is heavily outmatched as Georg was extremely agile. The idea was to stun Georg from the platform before donning the Zora mask and using the magic barrier to go down and hurt him. This was easier said than done, as trying to nail him from the platform as he was quickly dashing through the water made for a rough time. In the 3DS version, Georg actually gets fed up and smashes the platform you're on, forcing it under the water. In my honest opinion though, I think this made the fight slightly worse than the original, and instead of being more challenging, it just felt like it was dragging the fight on. Oracle of Seasons was initially developed as a remake of the original Legend of Zelda, and as a result, many of the game's bosses are just reskins of their predecessors, albeit with a few changes to their mechanics. In saying this though, Gleeok no longer holds the spot as the hardest boss, with that title now belonging to the great evil of this game, General Onox. Equipped with a chain and spiked ball, and no, not the fun type that you're thinking of, General Onox will rapidly spin this spiked ball around, slamming on the ground, causing a landslide of boulders to fall all across the arena. The only way to damage this guy was to use spin attacks, and getting close to him while dodging his slams and falling blocks proved pretty difficult for the time. After taking a few hits, General Onox will start to play dirty, who would send out Din to act as a barrier for him. Hitting Din with anything other than the Rod of Seasons would cause damage to Link, and was just an added inconvenience to an already stressful fight. And just when you think you've got him beat, he transforms into his true form, the Dark Dragon. This phase of the fight I would say is a lot easier than the initial one, with you avoiding his fire and swipe attacks before jumping up on his hand and finishing him off. Now while Oracle of Seasons blessed us with many familiar faces, Oracle of Ages was the opposite, featuring a multitude of new faces when it came to the boss roster. Twin Rover actually reappears in this game and offers up a nice challenge, and Ganon himself actually proved to be quite a bit tougher than his previous iterations. But, and hear me out here, a bit of a hot take coming in. The boss I consider to be the hardest is actually Smog.
What?
The reason why I always thought he was the hardest was because he wasn't just a straightforward fight. Smog would separate himself at the start of the fight into miniature versions of himself that travel around the room while shooting blue tornadoes at you. In order to defeat him, you had to use the Cane of Sumeria to create blocks that would redirect his parts back into one. As you progressed through each phase, more and more miniature versions of himself would appear. It was a puzzle disguised as a boss fight, and trying to work it out all while dodging these mini puffballs was certainly a tough challenge, at least for me. Now if you thought 4 swords referred to the 4 links you can play as, then you'd be wrong. 4 swords actually refers to the number of bosses in this game. Well, not actually, but out of every Zelda game, 4 swords by far has the least number of bosses. And I guess it makes sense, seeing as this game was just a small add-on included with the re-release of A Link to the Past on the Game Boy Advance. Now out of these 4 bosses, 2 of them actually proved to be somewhat difficult. In general, 4 swords played best when teaming up with others, so having to play it solo was always going to make for a tougher challenge. Taking this into consideration, I gotta say that the toughest boss is a slug. Derazol, to be precise. Now despite him being a slug, he seemingly bounces up and down with ease, looking to crush Link with his oversized body. These bounces are so impactful that it even causes icicles to drop from the ceiling that you must dodge. In order to defeat this guy, you'd have to charge at him with the Pegasus boots in hopes of knocking him into the ice wall, freezing him momentarily, allowing for you to hit him with sword strikes. Trying to knock him into the ice wall was a nightmare in single player, and for that reason, I always considered him to be the toughest out of the bunch. My personal favourite Zelda, which also happens to be some of the easiest bosses in the entire series. I guess that says more about me than anything else. But this one's a no-brainer. Puppet Ganon is by far the hardest boss in this game, and probably the only hard boss in this game. The fight takes place over the course of 3 phases, with Ganon taking a different form each time. Starting off with his boar form, Puppet Ganon dangles from the ceiling, and it's up to the player to use the boomerang to cut his strings, causing Puppet Ganon to fall to the ground. Players would then have to target the crystal orb on Ganon's tail, hitting it with a light arrow. Now after completing this task a few times, Ganon will shift into his spider form, before taking to the top of the room and spinning rapidly while falling. Now here you're supposed to look at the water to see his reflection, so then you know where he will land, but I remember my dumbass looking up at him while he was dropping, and getting clobbered as a result. All in all, this phase should be fairly simple, leading you into his final form, which also happens to be the most challenging. Ganon will shift into Moldorm, yes, that annoying bug from A Link to the Past, and if you think he's easier here, then you're in for a rough time. Ganon in this form will dart around the room rapidly, more often than not ramming into Link while doing so. The idea is the same as the previous phases, hit the crystal orb on his tail with a light arrow. The problem is, this time he's moving around at breakneck speeds. You could try and stun him with a sword slash or bomb, but these were always tough to time, so I just relied on my aim to get me through.
What are you aiming at?
Yeah, it took a few tries, but in comparison to the rest of Wind Waker's bosses, Puppet Ganon truly does stand a tier above. When working through this list, it actually occurred to me how Ganon, despite being the final boss of many of the previous games, was never really that difficult. At least not the most difficult. Well, that was until Four Swords Adventures, where Ganon is by far the hardest boss in the game. Ganon starts the fight by jumping around the arena, momentarily turning invisible, making it harder to see where he lands. He will then shoot out lightning that if hit, will send Link to the Dark World, where they must defeat a group of enemies before being able to escape. As the fight progresses, he will start to throw his massive trident around the tiny room, all while leaving a trail of blue fire to avoid. All in all, this is one of Ganon's most intimidating forms, and this fight in particular truly does feel like the culmination of everything thrown at you. In a similar sense to Wind Waker, when it comes to the Minish Cap, I think it's a no-brainer as to which of the 6 bosses come out on top as the most difficult. After having to slog your way through multiple Dark Nuts, one being the fabled Dark Knight, a mini-boss who was challenging in his own right, you stumble across Vaati at the end of Dark Hyrule Castle. Vaati then uses the power of the Light Force to transform into Vaati Reborn, and the first of 3 intense battles begins. Vaati summons eyeballs that shoot out lasers throughout this phase, all while teleporting around the room. Upon defeating this form, you would get teleported to the next area, now faced with Vaati transfigured. In this form, Vaati's eyes now surround one massive centerpiece eye, and it's up to the player to chip away at the eyes surrounding him with arrows. While you're attempting to do this, Vaati will be moving around the arena shooting out purple spikes that will remain on the ground unless destroyed. He also finds time to shoot electric orbs and causes rocks to fall down and hit you. Upon hitting 4 of these eyes, you could then clone yourself in the same pattern. May I remind you, it has to be the same pattern in order to destroy them. After seemingly beating him for the final time, and him groveling at the fact that he just got decimated by a little kid, you're then teleported to the final area, in which you must face his final form. The idea during this phase is to literally sneak into his arms, using the Minish Cap and dealing with the bladed eyes inside. After taking out his 2 arms, you then would have to deflect his beams back at him, and finally finish him off. All in all, this fight was a grueling, taxing and intense fight that truly did test you across all facets, and for that, it easily takes the spot as the most difficult boss in Minish Cap. Twilight Princess. You know, it might just have the best lineup of bosses across any Zelda game. I mean, who could forget that epic multi-phase Ganon fight, or the roller coaster of a showdown with Star-Lord in Arbiter's Grounds? Unfortunately, great bosses don't always translate into difficult ones, and this is where Twilight Princess falters a bit. These bosses, while extremely fun, were never that hard to deal with. Maybe it was because I had gotten older and better at the games, but I always thought the 2D Zelda bosses provided more of a challenge than any 3D boss, at least by this point. But when it comes to Twilight Princess, I always considered Zant to be not only the most interesting and fun boss, but also the most difficult. And I think it's the juxtaposition between his usual calm demeanor to the absolute psycho he becomes during the fight that really sells it. The main gimmick behind this fight is that Zant will teleport you to the arenas of all the previous bosses you fought so far. The idea is that you have to use the same strategies you had previously used in order to take him out. That is until he takes you to the market and just starts going completely nuts. flailing his arms around and spinning uncontrollably, while seamlessly teleporting throughout. This unpredictability is what makes this fight somewhat challenging, at least for me during my first playthrough. Overall, while it's one of the most interesting bosses in the game, and what I deem to be the hardest, it's not really that challenging once you know how to take him down. Now, we've come across the two most underappreciated games in the series. Maybe you could argue the Oracle games put up a good fight in that category, but Phantom Hourglass and Spirit Tracks are not only disregarded, but they're also considered some of the weakest entries into the series. Now, I'm not going to sit here and call them masterpieces or anything, but I think their boss lineups at least are pretty solid. Throughout Phantom Hourglass, you hear stories of this life-eating netherworld phantom that's been terrorizing the seas, sucking all the life force out of every living being. And when you finally come face to face with him, yeah, he's just some jellyfish thing. But what Bellum lacks in intimidation, he makes up for in his boss fight. His first phase isn't anything special and is pretty much a stair climbing simulator, going up to the second floor, knocking him down by healing his tentacles before collecting the Phantom Sphere and using it to power the Phantom Hourglass, stopping time and hitting Bellum's eye. The second phase is where things start getting spicy. He may have started as a jellyfish, but Bellum gets a slight upgrade once he possesses the ghost ship. Here accuracy is key, as you have to aim to destroy the ice sprouting from around the ghost ship, all while avoiding the shots Bellum launches at you. Upon finally sinking the ship, you face off in the final showdown, where Bellum now dons armor reminiscent of a knight and is invulnerable to all attacks from the front, easily parrying all your strikes. He moves slowly, but turns around quick enough that you can't just run around him to get behind him. You have to once again wait for the Phantom Sphere to power up the Hourglass, all while avoiding his powerful hits. It's quite a long and intense fight, and is certainly fitting as the final boss of the game. With Spirit Tracks, I wanted nothing more than to pick the Demon Train, because well, it's Spirit Tracks, so it would be fitting to have a train boss as the pick. But while I considered the Demon Train to be fairly challenging, if you're not paying attention, he never did give me as much trouble as Fraaz from the Snow Temple. He's somewhat similar to Twin Rover with his fire and ice abilities, but the method in which you take him out was completely different. It actually took me a while to figure out that you had to guide his attacks back at him with the boomerang. It may not seem too difficult, but because it's one of the earlier fights, you barely have any hearts, so taking hits can quickly prove fatal. It's because of this and his cheeky maneuvers that I believe he's the toughest boss in Spirit Tracks. Say what you will about Skyward Sword, love it or hate it, you have to admit that it has some pretty spectacular bosses, as well as some pretty bad ones as well. But we're focusing on the hardest, and among the numerous repeat battles, one stands atop the rest, and fittingly, it's the final boss fight against Demise. The Imprisoned could be argued, but I found that fight to be more of an annoyance than anything else. The fight against Demise is challenging, but fun. It takes place in two phases, the first of which sees you duking it out with Demise in a classic sword fight, where you'll have to avoid his slashes while fighting back with some of your own. Upon taking like 50 billion hits, Demise will charge his blade with lightning, now damaging you if you strike into it. At this point in the fight, Demise will most likely block all of your sword slashes, so your best bet is to copy him and also charge up your own sword with lightning. Playing at a distance will cause Demise to hit you with some pretty incredibly powerful attacks though, so you have to be prepared and avoid them at all cost. Upon dealing enough damage with Skyward Strikes or just regular sword slashes, Demise will fall down, prompting you to defeat him with a finishing blow. This was just a bait though, and Demise will always dodge it the first time around. It is possible to get it done the second time around, but each subsequent knockdown will increase the time required for him to recover. The fight in general is amazing, and the challenging nature of it is definitely warranted when looking at the scope in which you find yourself. A Link Between Worlds is an interesting one. I actually remember the ending better than most of the bosses, and I'm not sure if that's because the bosses weren't memorable, or the ending was just that good. But thankfully the boss I consider to be the hardest also happens to be the one you have to defeat to experience that beautiful ending. Ganon was the intimidating combined form of both Yuga and Ganon, and was so large he took up like half the arena. His attacks are pretty fast and take up a large area, with his dash attack in particular being quite difficult to avoid. Upon entering the second phase of the fight, Ganon takes advantage of the walls where he conceals himself while firing pink birds which move quickly and kind of converge on you, making them extremely difficult to avoid. In his final stage, he shoots off fast moving energy balls that you must consistently deflect back into him without missing the timing of. This fight is definitely the toughest out of a vast array of bosses in A Link Between Worlds. Cooperation was the name of the game with TriForce Heroes, and well, I never actually knew anyone that owned the game, so its bosses were quite frustrating. I'm not sure if any were downright hard though. The final boss was annoying to figure out, but if I had to pick one, I'd go with Blizzargia, the snake boss found at the end of the Ice Temple. This guy always seemed to give me a hard time. But again, your experiences in this game, especially against bosses, will most likely depend on what your teammates were doing. If they're not doing a whole lot, then every boss is probably a challenge. And for me, that just fell down to Blizzargia. Now, I don't necessarily like the idea of paid DLC, as most of the time the cost never seems to warrant the content you receive. But in the case of Breath of the Wild, and in particular this list, thank God this DLC exists. The base game, while brilliant, didn't fare well in terms of its bosses. In some cases, the mini-bosses found out in the world were actually a lot tougher. If this was restricted to just the base game, then I think the sheer speed of Thunderblight Ganon would definitely make him the top spot here. He was certainly a lot tougher than Calamity Ganon, which is honestly pretty sad. Taking place as the final trial, players must face Monk Maz Koshia, who is by far the hardest challenge in all of Breath of the Wild. Not only does he have the rapid speed that Thunderblight Ganon possessed, he also summons clones of himself that you can actually trick with bananas, funnily enough. And his final form has him become massive and float above you, throwing spiked balls and more of his little clones at you. All in all, he truly tests all that you've learned, and for the first few tries was actually super challenging. The reward for beating him and completing the trial is also top tier. We've arrived at the latest entry in this timeless franchise. Now, while I did get my ass handed to me by Queen Gibdo, I'm not sure I'd call her the most challenging boss. Spoiler warnings for anyone that's yet to reach the end, but it makes me happy to say that Demon King Ganondorf takes the spot as the toughest boss in Tears of the Kingdom, unlike his less than ideal counterpart in Breath of the Wild.
Is it over yet?
This incarnation of the Demon King really does put you to the test and the ultimate challenge. I don't want to really go into too much detail, considering there's probably a good handful that haven't had the chance to fight him, but the fight itself is uniquely challenging, mainly due to the new Gloom mechanic, which messes with your max health and ability to heal. Overall, while it's a decently challenging fight, it's one that the Demon King desperately needed, and rounds up what was already a magnificent game. And there's my final list. Feel free to comment if you disagree with these choices. I'm honestly intrigued as to what people consider to be the hardest fights in a franchise which, as a whole, isn't really considered to be extremely challenging. The bosses in this franchise, while not always being the most challenging, always have a place, whether that be to elicit a sense of progression after finally triumphing against them, or to help you learn and master that special item that you just discovered in their dungeon. They are always necessary, and something that I've always cherished. I hope you guys enjoyed this more chilled out video, and I hope to see you guys in the next one. Ciao.